is my safe space. Let's talk about that. So, a few days ago, the Caribbean bookworm, that's not his real name, made a video about how he discovered his favorite genre was the horror genre, which inspired me to talk about the horror genre too. I've always felt this pull towards, horror stories, but I never understood why until I read Stephen King's Danse Macabre. This amazing book by Stephen King. You should all read it, because I say so. It really helped me look at myself from the outside and figure out an answer to a question I've been asked a lot. Why are you like this? When I was younger, my parents wouldn't let me watch anything scary. So when I'd be staying at a friend's place whose parents were cool about horror movies, we would always watch horror movies. From The Nightmare on Elm Street to The Dawn of the Dead, and from The Ring to the Philippine movie Sigaw. It was my guilty pleasure to go to a friend's house and shit my pants. Though my affection for scarier themes had started way before I was allowed to stay at a friend's house, I used to make up my own stories about monsters and stuff when I was still 5, I think, or 6. And it wasn't because of anything I had watched previously, because at that age, my parents wouldn't let me anywhere near a TV. But even after that, there was this huge taboo at home. And my dad, I remember, he wouldn't even let me watch Casper because he's a ghost. And ghosts aren't real. Well, some people disagree, but yeah, ghosts aren't real. But it's not about what's real or not. Horror is everywhere, whether we like it or not. It's even in Disney movies. Horror is an emotion. Cruella wanted to turn puppies into a coat, but that was acceptable for children to watch. But it's not acceptable to watch the Harry Potter series. I hear people trying to explain to kids that what they watched wasn't real, so they shouldn't be afraid. But the point of a horror story is to make you afraid. It's supposed to scare you. If you don't believe it's real, then it won't scare you. 1 + 1 = 2. So I don't get why people are trying to ruin the experience for the rest of us. Yeah, of course I know that the zombies aren't real, but I still, want to watch a movie about zombies. Or maybe with a movie with zombies in it. But yeah, about zombies is okay too, like Warm Bodies. And before anyone comes for me, obviously I'm not advocating that a 5-year-old should watch the Saw movies, obviously, or the Midnight Mass series. I mean, at that point, they wouldn't even understand what they're looking at. But there are especially good stories curated and produced specifically for kids and teens. One teen horror series I found recently was The Midnight Club. I think it's rated 16+. And in spite of not being scary for me, I still enjoyed it. And I think it's pretty decent for its target audience. It's not too terrifying and it's not too lame. When I was a kid, my mom unknowingly bought me a book with short stories. Let me just show you. It's this book. It's called Ghostly Company, and it has a collection of short stories, which are horror stories actually. She went to the bookstore and asked for a book with short stories in it that would also enhance my English language knowledge, that was appropriate for the level of English the level I was at the time. but also age appropriate, because I was a bit more advanced than my classmates when it came to different languages. And they gave her this book, which has short stories in it with images, like this is an image of a ghost. But also they had questions of kind of analyzing and understanding the short stories, like right here in the next page. I don't know if it's like visible, but you get the point. One story in this book like literally terrified me. I couldn't go to bed for days. But another one put me in this never-ending spiral of questioning my existence, which is something I've appreciated. I've also grown to appreciate the Philippine legends, stories that my Filipino teacher would used to tell us in breaks about the aswang and the manananggal. These stories that used to keep me up at night when I was like 9 years old have now become my safe space. These are stories I turn to when I find myself afraid of real things like death and vampires. Vampires are real. Don't quote me. I have found that my parents and so many parents out there are kind of scared to let their kids be scared. But I think children should be able to experience all emotions. I'm not saying we should scare them to death, but an occasional age-appropriate scary story must be okay. Sometimes. I find I scared of Chino. He was sleeping, I'm so sorry. So I found that it's the same thing with sadness. Parents don't want their kids to be sad. I always hear things like, don't be scared, don't be sad. And no matter what the context is, I wonder why that is. Why aren't parents letting their kids experience all emotions? When I was a kid, I was terrified of earthquakes and the dark. Both are two very real things. Now, I'm over those things, obviously. But I clearly remember trying to oppress those fears in front of others. And I wouldn't allow myself to be afraid. Which, like, looking back, I think it's such a stupid thing to do when you're a kid. Like, just dumb, oppressing your feelings. Whatever those feelings are, even if they're good or bad. Like, I think we should just, let ourselves feel things. It's ironic how the same people that don't let their children watch ghost stories or vampire stories or whatever because they're not real are also the same people who tell their kids about this very real person named Santa Claus. Make up your minds already. So, a little story time. The very first memory I have of being afraid and sad at the same time was when I was, I think, like 5 years old, 4, 5, something like that. It was when my parents told me that Grandpa George would never visit us again. Grandpa George is not my real grandpa, but he was the only grandpa I knew at the time. My real grandpa was in another country, so yeah. Anyway, I remember being confused and I couldn't understand why he wouldn't want to see me again. And I would sit before the front door and wait for him, because I knew that wherever he wanted to go, he would never leave without saying goodbye. And I waited forever because he never showed up. And I remember being very sad and very scared. And that was actually my very first memory of losing someone. And of course, my parents tried to comfort me, like, don't be sad. He didn't want to leave. He had to, because God called him and he had to go. And don't be scared, because he didn't actually leave you. He left this world. It's not personal. Not very comforting. Well, I just remember being, like this little and being confused, and I didn't know what I was feeling. I didn't know what was happening, but I also remember that I never had the chance to explore the feelings of losing someone. And that followed me for many years because I didn't know how to handle feelings of fear and sadness. And growing up, I used to oppress those things. So please tell me I'm not alone in this. I think, I'm no expert, but I think I think that part of what pulls me towards this, the horror genre in general, is this oppression. No, not the oppression itself, but the relief instead. The relief that comes with watching a horror movie or reading a horror book. The relief of finally allowing myself to be scared. Even if, the monsters in the movies are not real, they're like a gateway to help me bring out feelings that society has deemed as unacceptable. It's the same reason I like stories that make me cry. I'm a person who cries very easily, which, obviously is not acceptable. You can't just cry for everything. So in my daily life, I suppress the urge to feel sad about anything. And when I finally watch a sad movie and just let the tears flow, it's a relief. When I know I'm going to watch a horror movie, I feel relieved. I have this talent, let's call it talent today. I have this talent of thinking about the worst case scenarios about anything and everything. It's my default, and although I try to control it, I haven't been able to get rid of it. In his book, Danse Macabre, Stephen King conveniently blames this on imagination. He summarizes everything I feel perfectly in a page or so, which I am going to read to you. In his foreword to the 2010 edition, What's Scary, he writes, So while Ma and Pa are downstairs watching American Idol, showing on Doritos and worrying that their favorite warbler may get voted off the show, their over-imaginative little sonny boy, or baby girl, is upstairs listening to Slipknot and wondering if Doritos give you cancer. This is so me. The imaginative person has a clearer fix on the fact of his/her fragility. The imaginative person realizes that anything can go disastrously wrong at any time. The imaginative person doesn't believe that serial killers only happen to other people. He or she understands that guys like Henry are actually out there, and running into one is a lot more likely than winning $350 million in the Powerball lottery. And there are a lot of other serial killers out there. They have names like cancer, stroke, or meeting a vodka-fueled alcoholic traveling southbound in the northbound lane of the turnpike, your lane, at 110 miles an hour, fantasizing that his crappy little Honda Accord is the Millennium Falcon. In a case like that, decapitation and instant death might be the best case scenario. Worst case, you wind up quadriplegic, pissing into a bag on your hip for 25 years or so. And the person with a supersize me imagination knows it. So he goes on to explain a little bit further. Those of us who feel more and see in darker spectrums may be sick puppies, but we're also lively puppies, brave puppies too, because we keep on trucking in the face of everything we know can go wrong. For us, horror movies are a safety valve. That's me. They are a kind of dreaming awake. And when a movie about ordinary people living ordinary lives skews off into some blood-soaked nightmare, we're able to let off the pressure that might otherwise build up until it blows us sky high, like the boiler that explodes and tears apart the Overlook Hotel in The Shining. Parenthesis. The book, in the movie, everything freezes solid. How dorky is that? He actually wrote that. I love Stephen King. You should all read this book. Anyway, this page summarizes everything so perfectly. Danse Macabre actually helped me understand myself better. When the first surge of relief came to me back in 2012, when I got into university, and I was living alone and nobody was monitoring what I was watching. I watched like every single horror movie and horror series that was available on the internet at the time, and there were people at the time who would turn their back on me when they listened about what I was watching. Tusk, for instance, is a movie I really enjoyed because I believe that it explored the opportunistic nature of a human being when it comes to survival. And it also explored mental stability. And it did so in such a ridiculous manner that my friends were appalled by it. I recognize that some aspects of the movie are ridiculous, but I think if it wasn't, then it wouldn't have delivered as much as it did. And many years later, today, I still stand by my verdict that Tusk is a good movie. Not the best, but it's still good. But since then, I've moved on to even darker stories that focus on the human element. And one I watched recently was called Sisi, which was released earlier this year and was so, what's the word? Breathtaking. Horror for the sake of horror, like in Wrong Turn and Hostel, that doesn't do it for me. I need a deep connection to the human element, like in the case of Get Out and Hereditary, and even The Haunting of Bly Manor and Midnight Mass are even series that I have loved. They're up there, my two favorite horror series. There are so many things I would like to talk about Hereditary and Midnight Mass, but for the sake of respecting your time, I won't do it today. Thing is that for most of my life, I've been getting weird looks about my addiction to horror, if you can say it, which most of the time left me feeling left out. Yeah, I loved The Fault in Our Stars and Me Before You, but I don't think that there's something that makes these movies inherently better than, say, The Autopsy of Jane Doe or It Follows, which are two movies I also absolutely loved. Yeah, I enjoy horror. Get over it! Making friends with other people who loved horror movies and horror books has been a life changer. Today I focused mostly on movies and series instead of books, but it's the same thing actually. And I think that if it weren't for those people, I would have struggled with, the books I read and the books I write. Looking back at my first stories, the elements of horror is lacking, because I wrote mostly what I thought my friends wanted to read. When I finally decided to write the stories that I wanted to read, I was terrified. But then I found On Writing Horror by the Horror Writers Association, the American one. Is there any other writers association? In this book, many writers express how the genre they've chosen to write on has affected the way people respect their work, which I think is really sad. But for me, getting my hands on this book actually pushed me towards writing my first novel. And let me tell you something. My novel, I have a copy here, The Shadows We Live In. It terrified me. I was scared of the protagonist. There was a human factor in it, which is something that gets me every time. And it's the reason I connected with my protagonist as I tried to understand her mind and justify her actions. She scared me a lot, but in the end, I felt sad for her. I think now, looking back, I think that my story is both sad and scary, because maybe I was trying to explore the feelings I've been oppressing. Maybe I was trying to explore my own feelings of fear and sadness. Those feelings that I choke back every so often for the sake of being a well-adjusted, well-functioning human neighbor. But enough with the introspect. I don't know if anything I said today made sense. Do you like horror? Do you not? And why? I always thought there needn't be a reason, to love something. But apparently, if you dig into it, you can find reasons. So yeah, don't forget to check out the Caribbean Bookworms video, which I will link in the description right below. And I'll see you next week. Bye. Bye. This skull is so small. Is it the right size yet? Should I? Oh, I can't see. I can't search. Must be somewhere there.